The Andromedas Prime Academy for Advanced Interdimensional Studies sat at the edge of the Kepler Nebula like a monument to intellectual superiority, which, to be fair, it absolutely was. For 3,000 years, the finest minds across 47 sentient species had gathered within its crystalline spires to unlock the universe's deepest secrets. And if you're wondering whether they were smug about it, the answer is yes. Catastrophically so. The Academy's admission standards made getting into a decent afterlife look easy by comparison. Only 0.003% of applicants ever saw the inside of a lecture hall, and even fewer survived the first semester without having their egos surgically removed through rigorous academic humiliation. The institution prided itself on crushing dreams with the efficiency of a neutron star crushing matter because apparently that's what passed for pedagogy among the galaxy's elite. Now, here's where things get interesting. In that special way that precedes disaster, humans had recently been granted provisional access to galactic academic institutions, a decision that half the Intergalactic Education Consortium still considered somewhere between questionable judgment and cosmic practical joke. See, humanity had only cracked faster-than-light travel about 40 years ago, which in galactic terms made them the educational equivalent of that kid who just learned to read showing up at a philosophy doctorate program. Most species had been navigating the stars for millennia before humans figured out that banging rocks together could make fire. The general consensus among the galactic academic community was that letting humans into advanced programs was like handing a toddler a plasma cutter and hoping for the best. But here's the thing about provisional access. It came with an asterisk the size of a small moon. Humans could attend, sure, but they'd be watched, judged, and generally expected to fail spectacularly enough to justify their inevitable expulsion. It was tolerance wearing a mask of patronizing generosity, and everyone knew it. The lecture hall of Advanced Quantum Fold Engineering occupied the Academy's 7th translucent spire. Suspended in what appeared to be absolutely nothing but was actually a stable pocket of folded space-time. Because of course it was. The room itself defied conventional architecture in ways that would make an Earth-based architect weep into their blueprints. Seating arranged itself in impossible geometries, allowing every student a perfect view regardless of position. While the teaching platform floated in the center, rotating through dimensions most species couldn't even perceive without serious neural augmentation. On this particular morning, which was actually evening in 6 different time zones simultaneously because interstellar scheduling is a nightmare, approximately 200 students filtered into the hall. They came in all configurations. Crystalline, Vexithari, who processed information through light refraction, gaseous Numids, whose thoughts manifested as color changes in their containment fields, the chitinous Theks, with their compound eyes and aggressive note-taking appendages, and roughly 40 other species whose names humans could barely pronounce without risking a diplomatic incident. And then there was Maya Reeves. She slipped into the hall with the practiced invisibility of someone who'd learned that drawing attention rarely ended well. Average height by human standards, which made her laughably tiny compared to most of the student body. Dark hair pulled back in a functional ponytail. Clothes that screamed, "I'm not here to make a fashion statement," in several languages. And an expression that suggested she was actively calculating the probability of surviving the next 2 hours without incident. Maya had secured a spot in the Academy through a combination of genuinely impressive academic credentials and what the admissions committee had undoubtedly considered a diversity quota. Nothing says, "We're inclusive," quite like admitting a single representative from a species most of the galaxy considered only marginally more advanced than particularly clever dolphins. She'd been at Andromedas Prime for exactly 6 weeks, which was long enough to understand the social hierarchy, but not long enough for anyone to care about learning her name. The other students treated her with the kind of distant politeness usually reserved for malfunctioning service drones, acknowledged when absolutely necessary, ignored the rest of the time, and certainly not worth engaging in actual conversation. Maya had developed a survival strategy that served her well. Sit in the middle rows where she was neither conspicuously eager nor suspiciously disengaged. Never volunteer answers unless directly called upon. And for the love of all that was holy, never give anyone a reason to remember she existed. It was the academic equivalent of camouflage, and it had worked perfectly. Until today. Because today, Krelvax was in a mood. Krelvax belonged to the Zentari, a species that had mastered interstellar travel while humans were still figuring out that washing hands might prevent disease. They were tall, absurdly so, with smooth obsidian skin that seemed to absorb light, three-fingered hands that moved with unnerving precision, and cranial crests that grew more elaborate with age and achievement. Krelvax's crest suggested he came from a bloodline that had been academically dominating for generations. Because apparently, even alien species couldn't escape the legacy admission problem. He sat in the front quadrant, naturally, surrounded by a constellation of admirers and sycophants who laughed at his observations with the enthusiasm of people who understood their social survival depended on it. Krelvax had the kind of confidence that comes from never being wrong, mostly because everyone was too intimidated to correct him. His academic record was, admittedly, impressive. Top marks in spatial mathematics, quantum field theory, and advanced temporal mechanics. 3 published papers before his 20th solar cycle. Recommendations from professors who used words like prodigy and brilliant with disturbing frequency. He was exactly the kind of student who made professors nod approvingly and other students contemplate changing majors. But here's the thing about people who've never been challenged. They don't develop the muscle for intellectual humility. And Krelvax had the humility of a supernova, which is to say, none whatsoever, with a tendency to consume everything around him. As students settled into their impossible seating arrangements, Professor Thalexon glided into the room. Thalexon was a morphid, a species that existed in a state of controlled semi-liquidity, maintaining form through sheer concentration and what humans would recognize as aggressive willpower. They wore a containment field that shimmered like oil on water and communicated through a combination of directed thought waves and colored light patterns that the translation matrix converted into comprehensible language. Today, Thalexon began, their voice resonating through everyone's auditory processing centers regardless of species. We examine the theoretical limits of quantum fold propulsion as it applies to transgalactic navigation. The holographic display materialized in the center of the room, showing complex mathematical formulas that looked like someone had made a language out of pure anxiety. Equations spiraled through 3-dimensional space, variables shifting and recombining in patterns that would give most Earth mathematicians nightmares requiring therapy. Maya pulled out her tablet, human-made and laughably primitive compared to the neural interface systems most students used, and began taking notes. She'd developed a hybrid system that combined human mathematical notation with galactic standard, creating something that probably looked like academic graffiti to anyone else, but worked perfectly for her brain's particular wiring. The fundamental challenge, Thalexon continued, lies in maintaining coherence across fold boundaries. Who can explain the primary stabilization paradox? Several appendages shot up, eager to demonstrate knowledge. Krelvax's hand rose with the casual certainty of someone who knew he'd be called on eventually. The stabilization paradox emerges from quantum uncertainty at boundary intersections, Krelvax said smoothly, his voice carrying that particular tone of someone who'd memorized the textbook and believed that constituted understanding. Standard Vexitharian compensation matrices resolve this through distributed field generation. Adequate, Thalexon responded, which in academic terms meant technically correct but uninspiring. The professor's containment field shifted to a vaguely disappointed shade of blue. Krelvax's crest stiffened slightly, the Zentarii equivalent of a frown. Being called adequate was apparently not part of his self-image. That's when his gaze swept across the room and landed on Maya, hunched over her primitive tablet, scribbling away with what looked like actual manual input. His eyes narrowed with the particular malice of someone who just found an outlet for wounded pride. "Professor," Krelvax said, his voice taking on that false, curious tone that everyone immediately recognized as a prelude to cruelty. "I've noticed our human colleague takes extensive notes. Perhaps she could share her insights on the stabilization paradox? I'm certain her species has unique perspectives on quantum mechanics." The room went quiet with that special silence that precedes either disaster or entertainment, which in academic settings are often the same thing. Every sensory organ in the hall turned toward Maya. The Vexthari's crystalline bodies refracted light in her direction. The Numid's gases swirled with anticipatory colors. Even the Thecs stopped their note-taking, compound eyes glittering with interest. Maya looked up slowly from her tablet, and for just a moment, something flickered across her expression. Not panic, not even annoyance. Something closer to the look a person gets when they realize they're about to do something they know they shouldn't, but are going to do anyway. "I wouldn't want to take up class time," she said carefully, which was human for, "Please let me continue being invisible." "Nonsense," Krelvax pressed, leaning back in his seat with the body language of someone settling in to watch a show. Academic discourse benefits from diverse viewpoints, even limited ones. There it was, the gauntlet, dropped with all the subtlety of a collapsing star. Professor Thalexon's containment field shifted to an uncertain yellow. Protocol demanded they allow student discussion, but the tension in the room suggested this was about to go somewhere messy. Maya set down her stylus with deliberate precision. When she looked up, her expression had shifted into something unreadable. "The Vextharian compensation matrices are elegant," she began, her voice steady and unnervingly calm. "But they're not actually resolving the paradox. They're just moving it." Krelvax's crest rippled, which humans would recognize as the alien equivalent of a shark sensing blood in the water. "Moving it? Please, enlighten us on how one of the galaxy's most respected mathematical frameworks is somehow insufficient." "It's not insufficient," Maya continued. And there was something almost conversational about her tone, like she was discussing the weather rather than challenging established theory. "It's incomplete. The Vexitharian model treats quantum uncertainty as a problem to be compensated for. But that's a fundamental misunderstanding of what uncertainty actually is." She stood up, which was probably a mistake from a continuing to be invisible standpoint, but excellent from a dramatic impact perspective. "The stabilization paradox exists because we're approaching fold boundaries with the assumption that coherence is the natural state and uncertainty is the deviation. But quantum mechanics doesn't work that way. Uncertainty isn't a bug in the system, it's the system. The paradox isn't something to resolve, it's something to utilize." The room's silence had evolved from anticipatory to genuinely attentive. Even Professor Thalexon's containment field had shifted to an intrigued green. Krelvax, however, had the expression of someone who'd expected a mouse and encountered a wolverine. That's a fundamental misunderstanding of quantum field theory. Uncertainty cannot be utilized for propulsion stabilization. "Why not?" Maya asked, and there was something almost gentle about the question, the way a demolition expert might gently ask about a building's load-bearing walls before placing charges. Because uncertainty is by definition unpredictable, Krelvax said, his voice taking on the patience of someone explaining basic concepts to a child. Propulsion requires predictable outcomes. Does it, though? Maya tilted her head slightly. Or does it require consistent outcomes? Because those aren't the same thing. She walked down to the central platform, her human height making her look almost comically small next to the holographic displays, and reached into the projection. Her hands moved through the equations, manipulating them with the facility of someone who actually understood what they meant, rather than just memorizing their shapes. "Look at the Vextharian model here," she said, highlighting a section of the equations. "It's creating artificial coherence by imposing external order on quantum uncertainty. That works, sure, but it requires massive energy expenditure because you're fighting against the fundamental nature of quantum mechanics. The energy expenditure is negligible with proper reactor configuration," Krelvax countered, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. Negligible? Maya turned to look at him, and there was something sharp in her expression now. The standard Vextharian fold drive requires approximately 40% of total reactor output just for stabilization. You consider that negligible? She turned back to the equations, her fingers dancing through the holographic space. But if you stop treating uncertainty as something to fight and instead treat it as a resource, the mathematics change completely. Her hands moved faster now, pulling apart the existing equations and rebuilding them into something new. The other students leaned forward, even those whose species didn't process visual information in conventional ways. Uncertainty in quantum systems isn't random, it's probabilistic. And probability has structure. If you map the probability space of quantum uncertainty at fold boundaries, you get what humans call a phase space landscape. And that landscape has topography, valleys and peaks of probability density. She built the new model in real time, equations spiraling out from her fingertips like she was conducting an orchestra of mathematics. Instead of forcing coherence across the boundary, you navigate the probability landscape. You don't fight the uncertainty, you surf it. Krelvax stood up, his considerable height making Maya look even smaller by comparison. But somehow that didn't translate into presence the way it should have. That's absurd. You can't navigate probability. It's not a physical space. Isn't it? Maya's smile was the mathematical equivalent of a knife. Quantum mechanics treats observation as creating physical outcomes from probability states. Navigation is just structured observation. You're not moving through probability space in the conventional sense. You're collapsing probability functions in sequence to create a path. She pulled up a new set of equations, and these were definitely not standard Vextharian mathematics. They had a different structure, more organic somehow, like they'd grown rather than been constructed. Humans figured this out by accident, actually, she continued. And there was something almost conversational about her tone now, like she was sharing a funny story. We were so far behind in quantum field theory that we had to develop our own approaches from scratch. We didn't have thousands of years of established frameworks to build on, so we started from first principles. She rotated the holographic display, showing the mathematics from different angles. And one of those first principles is that nature is fundamentally lazy. Physical systems take the path of least resistance. So why would quantum systems be any different? Krelvax's crest had flattened against his skull, which was the Zentarii equivalent of deep concern. You're suggesting that established quantum fold theory, refined over millennia, is somehow wrong? No, Maya said. and her voice was patient in a way that somehow made it worse. I'm saying it's overcomplicated. You've built this elegant, sophisticated framework that works by brute forcing the universe into compliance. And it does work, I'm not arguing that. But it's the difference between damming a river and learning to navigate it. She pulled up comparative models side by side. Look at the energy signatures. The Vextharian model here, energy expenditure in red. Now look at a probability navigation model based on first principles. The difference was stark. The standard model showed massive energy spikes at fold boundaries, exactly as she'd described. Peaks of force required to maintain artificial coherence. The alternative model showed something closer to a smooth curve, following the natural probability landscape rather than fighting against it. That's theoretical, Krelvac said, but his voice had lost its aggressive certainty. Now he sounded like someone trying to convince himself. It hasn't been tested. Actually, it has. Maya's smile widened slightly. Human fold drives are significantly less powerful than standard galactic models, right? We've got maybe a quarter of the reactor output of equivalent Zentarii ships. But our fold efficiency is within 12% of galactic standard, despite having a fraction of the energy budget. She let that hang in the air for a moment. Everyone assumed humans were just lucky, or that our drives were somehow dangerously unstable. But we've been running probability navigation models for 15 years without incident. We've been surfing the uncertainty this whole time. We just didn't have the theoretical framework to explain it properly until now. The lecture hall had gone completely silent. Even Professor Thalixon's containment field had settled into a steady, focused blue. Krelvac stared at the comparative models, his three-fingered hands gripping the edge of his desk. That would mean our entire approach to quantum fold engineering is less efficient by a factor of, 30%? Closer to 42%, actually, Maya said, and there was absolutely no mercy in her voice now. But who's counting? She walked back through the holographic display, equations parting around her like water. The funny thing is, this is exactly what makes humans dangerous to your established frameworks. We don't know enough to know what's supposedly impossible. We look at your elegant, sophisticated solutions and ask stupid questions like, but why though? And sometimes, just sometimes, those stupid questions reveal that the elegant solution is solving the wrong problem. Krelvac sat down slowly, his movements mechanical, like someone whose entire worldview was being recalibrated in real time. Around him, other students had begun pulling up their own displays, running calculations, checking her mathematics. The Vexthari student 3 rows back made a sound like crystalline wind chimes, their species' expression of profound surprise. A Numid's containment field cycled through colors that roughly translated to, I need to rethink my entire thesis. The Theks were clicking their mandibles in patterns that indicated furious recalculation. Of course, Maya continued. And now she was walking back to her seat with the casual air of someone who just remembered they'd left something cooking. This is all just theoretical speculation from a primitive species that barely understands quantum mechanics. So maybe don't take it too seriously. The sarcasm was so thick you could build a space station on it. She sat back down, picked up her stylus, and returned to her notes as if she'd just commented on the temperature rather than systematically dismantled several millennia of established theory. Professor Thalixon's containment field cycled through approximately 15 different colors in rapid succession, which was the morphid equivalent of buffering. When they finally spoke, their voice had a quality that suggested they were running multiple thought processes simultaneously, and all of them were screaming. That That is an extraordinarily provocative framework, they managed. The mathematics will require extensive peer review, but the fundamental logic appears sound. Krelvac sat at his desk, looking like someone who just watched their house burn down and was trying to remember if they'd left the stove on. His crest had gone completely flat, pressed against his skull in a way that suggested either deep thought or complete system failure. The students who'd been clustered around him had subtly shifted away, suddenly very interested in their own work. "Miss Reeves?" Thalikson continued, their field now a bemused orange. "Would you be willing to present a formal analysis of your probability navigation framework at the next departmental symposium?" Maya looked up from her notes, stylus still in hand. "Sure. I've actually got most of it already written up. Submitted it to 3 different journals 2 months ago." The silence that followed that statement was deafening. You've already written this up?" Thalikson's field flickered. What was the response? "Rejection from all 3. Maya said with a shrug that suggested this was about as surprising as water being wet. The reviewers said the framework was too speculative and didn't align with established quantum fold theory. One of them actually wrote that human understanding of quantum mechanics was insufficiently developed to make meaningful contributions to the field. She said it without bitterness, just stating facts, which somehow made it worse. A Vexithari student in the back, one of the crystalline beings whose name humans absolutely could not pronounce, chimed in with a sound like breaking glass. The translation matrix rendered it as, "The human presents valid mathematical frameworks, and we dismiss them because of species prejudice. This is why peer review is failing." "I mean, to be fair," Maya said, and there was something almost kind about her tone now. "I am from a species that discovered fire approximately 5 minutes ago on the galactic timescale. Skepticism isn't entirely unreasonable." "The mathematics do not care about timescales," another voice added, this one from a Numid whose gas cloud was swirling in agitated patterns. "Either the framework is valid or it is not. Species of origin is irrelevant." Krelvac finally found his voice, though it came out somewhat strangled. "The energy efficiency calculations, those are based on theoretical models, not actual implementation data." "Actually," Maya said, pulling up her tablet and swiping through files with practiced ease, "they're based on 15 years of flight data from the human exploration fleet. Every fold jump recorded, analyzed, and compiled. I've got approximately 40,000 discrete data points backing up the efficiency claims." She sent the file to the central display, and suddenly the room was looking at more raw data than most doctoral theses contained. Flight records, energy signatures, fold stability readings, all meticulously documented and cross-referenced. "Humans keep really good records," she added. "It's one of our things. We're kind of obsessive about it, actually. Probably because we spent most of our history not understanding how anything worked and needed to write everything down so we could figure it out later." A Thek student, compound eyes glittering with what might have been respect or possibly hunger, clicked a question through the translation matrix. "Why did you not present this data in your journal submissions?" "I did," Maya said. "It was dismissed as potentially fabricated because human instrumentation was considered too primitive for accurate quantum fold measurements." She paused. "Which, again, fair. Our instruments are primitive compared to galactic standard. We just happen to build them specifically for measuring quantum fold phenomena because that's all we had to work with." The room was experiencing what could only be described as a collective existential crisis. The kind that happens when an entire academic community realizes they've been so busy being sophisticated that they missed something fundamental. Professor Thelixson floated in the center of the room, their containment field cycling through colors that suggested they were having several intense internal debates simultaneously. Finally, they settled on a determined purple. "Class is dismissed," they announced. "I need to contact the department head and possibly restructure the entire curriculum. Miss Reeves, please remain after." Students began filing out in a daze, the kind of mental fog that follows having your worldview rearranged. The Vexithari were already forming discussion clusters, their crystalline bodies refracting light in patterns that indicated intense mathematical debate. The Numids were sharing data through direct gas exchange, which was their equivalent of heated argument. Even the Theks, normally aggressive note-takers, were too stunned to document properly. Krelvac stood slowly, moving like someone who'd aged several decades in the space of an hour. He looked at Maya, and something complicated crossed his face. Not quite respect, not quite resentment. Something in between that might eventually ferment into understanding. "You let us underestimate you," he said finally. "No," Maya corrected gently. "You underestimated me all on your own. I just didn't waste energy correcting you." He nodded slowly, crest still flat against his skull, and walked out. The cluster of students who'd orbited him had already dispersed, finding new social gravitational centers now that his sun had dimmed. When the hall had emptied, Maya stood and approached the floating platform where Professor Thelixson waited, their containment field now a curious mix of colors that suggested complex emotions. That was either brilliantly strategic or monumentally reckless. The professor said, "I haven't decided which." "Probably both," Maya admitted. "I wasn't planning on the demonstration, but when he pushed, it seemed like the options were either continue being invisible or make it impossible to ignore me. There wasn't much middle ground." "You realize you've just made yourself a target," Thelixson observed. "Academic circles are not kind to those who disrupt established frameworks, especially when the disruptor is from a species most consider barely qualified to attend." "Yeah," Maya said, and there was a tiredness in her voice that suggested she'd been carrying this weight for a while. "But I was already a target. At least now I'm a target who might actually change something." The professor's field shifted to something that might have been approval in morphid emotional language. "The departmental symposium is in 3 weeks. Prepare for intensive scrutiny. The review panel will attempt to dismantle your framework from every possible angle." "Good," Maya said simply. "That's how science is supposed to work. If the framework can't survive scrutiny, it doesn't deserve to." She gathered her primitive tablet and her handwritten notes, artifacts of a species still learning to navigate the galaxy. As she turned to leave, Thelixson called after her, "Miss Reeves? For what it's worth, I apologize. Your initial journal submissions should never have been dismissed based on species prejudice. That was a failure of academic integrity." Maya paused at the doorway, looking back at the morphid professor floating in their containment field. Apology accepted. But maybe use that energy to fix the system instead. I'm not the only human trying to contribute, and I'm definitely not the only non-standard species getting dismissed for not fitting the established mold. She left, walking through corridors of crystalline architecture that humanity had barely begun to understand, past students from species that had been navigating the stars while humans were discovering agriculture. Word of the incident spread through the academy with the speed of quantum entanglement, which is to say, faster than seemed physically possible. By evening, every student, professor, and administrative drone in Andromeda's Prime had heard some version of the story. Details varied wildly, the academic equivalent of a game of telephone played across species lines. Some versions had Maya solving equations while standing on the desk. Others claimed she'd made Krelvax cry, which was biologically impossible for Zentari, but made for good storytelling. A few had completely invented her proposing an entirely new branch of physics, which wasn't technically true, but wasn't entirely wrong either. The truth, as usual, was both simpler and more complex than the mythology building around it. In her small dormitory module, designed for human habitation in an academy built for 47 different species' needs, Maya sat at a desk that was probably meant for someone half her size, and pulled up her journal submission files. 3 rejections, all politely worded versions of, "Thanks, but your species isn't qualified to have opinions yet." She opened a new document and began drafting her symposium presentation. This time, there would be no polite dismissals. This time, they'd have to engage with the mathematics directly, and either prove her wrong or accept that humanity's lack of sophisticated theory might have accidentally led to more fundamental understanding. The irony wasn't lost on her. Humans had been so far behind that they'd had to start from scratch, building understanding from first principles rather than inherited frameworks. And sometimes, just sometimes, starting from scratch meant seeing things everyone else had overlooked. It was the academic equivalent of children asking, "But why?" until adults realized they didn't actually have a good answer. 3 weeks later, Maya would stand in front of the most prestigious physics faculty in the galaxy and defend her framework. They would attack it from every conceivable angle, deploying millennia of accumulated expertise in attempts to find flaws. And in the end, after 17 hours of intense scrutiny, they would be forced to admit that the primitive species from the backwater planet had accidentally revolutionized quantum fold engineering by not knowing enough to know it was impossible. But that's a story for another time. For now, in a lecture hall that existed in folded space-time, the lesson had been taught. Not the one in the curriculum about quantum fold stabilization, but a more fundamental lesson about assumptions and arrogance and the danger of underestimating someone because their species only recently figured out that washing hands was a good idea. Krelvax would recover, eventually. His ego was bruised, but not broken. And he had enough genuine intelligence to learn from the experience once the wounded pride healed. He'd go on to become a decent researcher, more cautious about assumptions, more willing to consider alternative frameworks. The humiliation would make him better, in the long run, though he'd never quite achieved the prominence he'd once considered his birthright. The real casualty was the certainty. That comfortable assumption that galactic academic institutions had reached the pinnacle of understanding, that established frameworks were established for good reasons, that thousands of years of accumulated knowledge meant there was nothing fundamental left to discover. Maya had killed that certainty, left it dead on the classroom floor next to Krelvax's pride. And somewhere in the quantum probability space between what was and what might be, the universe continued not caring about anyone's theories, human or otherwise, content to be exactly as weird and wonderful and fundamentally uncertain as it had always been. The equation didn't change, but humanity had just changed how the galaxy understood it. Which, when you think about it, is exactly the kind of thing a species too young to know better would do. And that, perhaps, was the most human thing about the whole situation.